Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. So happy to be back with you tonight for the second session of this November-December book series. Please, as always, say hello in the chat. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to see who's in the room with us. Also, throughout the conversation, please add your questions in the chat and we'll pull them into the conversation. We're so delighted that we're able to continue gathering together from all around the world for these meaningful conversations and learning, and grateful as always to Jewish Live for streaming. Before we start our conversation, I wanted to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. And the book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I hope you'll take the time to check out jwa.org and explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. I am so delighted tonight to welcome Michael Frank, the author of 100 Saturdays, Stella Levi and the Search for a Lost World, which won the Jewish Book Council's 2022 Natan Notable Book Award, and which we'll be discussing tonight. He is also the author of the novel What is Missing and the memoir The Mighty Franks, which won the 2018 J.Q. Wingate Prize. Michael's essays, articles, and short stories have appeared in many publications, from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Slate, the TLS, Tablet, Yale Review, among others. His fiction has been presented at Symphony Space's Selected Shorts, and his travel writing has been collected in Italy, the best travel writing for the New York Times. He is a recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship and lives with his family in New York and in Italy. Welcome, Michael. So glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to the Jewish Women's Archive for this wonderful, I hope, wonderful conversation.
I am sure it will be, and welcome to everyone who's with us. So this is a beautiful and somewhat unusual book. It records the stories of Stella Levi. Does she pronounce it Levy?
Levy.
Levy,
Yeah.
who grew up in the Sephardic Jewish community of Rhodes in the Jewish neighborhood called the JWA, which came to an abrupt and tragic end when the whole community of about 1,700 people was deported to Auschwitz in July of 1944. And she hadn't really shared much of the details of her story before meeting you. So give us a little background of how this book came to be and how you entered into this relationship with Stella that became this project.
With pleasure. It's funny that you say it's hard to describe. Why don't we just start with that? Because I too don't really know how to describe this book, because it's not a memoir, it's not a biography, it's not a work of history, it's not a work of fiction. And I've sort of settled on calling it an encounter. This book is my encounter with Stella, really, with encounter with another storyteller. I'm a storyteller, she's a storyteller, and together we tell this story. I met Stella in 2015 at a lecture, fittingly on memorials to the Holocaust. She sat down, we had a rather provocative exchange with which I nearly opened the book, or the second part of the book, so I won't tell it here because we'll wait for everyone to read it. And that we turned out we knew somebody in common. I was captivated by her, curious about her, and we met the Saturday following this lecture, and I asked her a question about her life, her childhood, and she started to answer it, and then she sort of stopped like Scheherazade and made me come back. And I went back to her house and continued this conversation for more than 100 Saturdays spread over the following 6 years. And it was a transformative experience for me. I, like many people, I go into the world now, or even before the book was out, and people say, what are you working on? And I'd say, well, what do you know about the island of Rhodes? And then I go from there to, do you know that there was a storied Jewish community that had been there since leaving Spain in the 15th century, since the expulsion from Spain? Do you know what happened to them during the war? Do you know that they were an Italian colony? Do you know? And the answer is always, almost always, no, we don't know. And so I was like everyone else, not knowing, and wanted to find out about this remarkable world of Spanish Jews who had been living for almost 500 years by the time Stella was born in 1923 in this island in the remote Aegean, virtually in Turkey, with so many of their language, their customs, their food, their proverbs, 14,000 proverbs, their music intact, relatively intact, despite the fact that modernity was coming at them, with all the force and velocity that it did in the early 20th century in so many places. And Stella's story has, this is known, and it's also part of the reason for the book. It has the anchoring, horrible tragedy of Auschwitz in the middle of it, but it was important to her and became increasingly important to me that I come to understand and know about the place she came from first. And so that's where we began.
Mm-hmm.
That's where she made me begin, let's just say, because let's say she's very clear thinking, a very determined person with a lot of fresh and original ideas about herself, about life in general, about how we should talk about the Holocaust. And, I rushed in with my, okay, tell me about the camp sort of question. And there, she was not having any of that. And I've come to see the great wisdom in that approach.
And I can tell from the way you wrote the book, and we'll get to how you, put it together later, but that she told stories in a kind of circular way and teased you a little bit, and
yes,
took her time to unravel the whole narrative, or maybe unravel is not the right word. Maybe it was really about rediscovering it for herself.
Well, I think that's quite astute. I mean, I don't think we all sit down ahead of, who hasn't encountered like this, first of all? Not that many people, but let's assume you're the person who knows you're going to have an encounter like this. I don't think you've sat down in advance and thought out, okay, I'm going to recount the story of my life like this. Memory begets memory. And I think that was very true for Stella. I think at one point she said to me, the more I tell you, the more I find I have to tell you. So this process of excavation was for her, I think, to some degree, also a discovery and a journey and a surprise. We together found our way into the story of her life. It's the only way I can say it. I didn't go in with, because, I think I didn't go in with a predetermined understanding of what it was I should be doing also. I think I'm an okay listener. And so I listened for things that were said and unsaid and did my best to try to navigate them and negotiate them with her. And there are many things, some very simple and basic things that I didn't ask because I didn't think to ask. And she didn't think to tell me because they were so obvious, and that's fascinating too. It's like, if you don't know what it is you're looking to hear, you don't know. That's the fascinating thing. And so that, that's when I began reading, talking to other people, trying to gather as much other in stimuli as I could to kind of bring that back to Stella. And even so, she continued to surprise me all the way.
And you didn't start out thinking it was going to be a book, right? It started out just.
I definitely had no idea. I was clueless. I went there. All of our conversations, I should say, were in Italian. We should probably spend a moment, discussing what languages were spoken in that culture, that time, and that place. And I took notes, but my joke is that I take notes when my mother calls, because you just never know where there's going to be a great story. And I took notes, obviously, with some idea that it was worth doing. Did I think I would write a book? No, it took me more than a year, and it took us a long time to trust each other as well. Mm-hmm. Understandably.
Well, I'd love for you to share a little bit from the book, and then I'm also going to share some of the clip that you shared with me of Stella, so that we can bring her spirit into the room. But why don't you begin by sharing an excerpt so that people can get a sense, those who haven't.
Oh, you want me to do? Okay, I think actually I will do that, but I think it is important to know, for people who don't know anything about the story, the few key things to know, because the excerpt will be so much more resonant, which is Rhodes was an Italian colony. It had been Turkish until 1912, as the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. The Italians wanted a colonial presence because they were a new nation, and this is how you formed your identity, was by owning other lands. Let's just say conquering people, essentially. Rhodes had an appeal because it was not exactly a third world country. So it was, it had been, the Romans had been there, so there was like this sort of old sense of connection. It was a fascist project, obviously. And when they came, what they found in the Juderia were these people who had been living there, as I say, and conducting their lives much as they had been for the past 500 years. At home, they spoke Judeo-Spanish, which is the specific name these days given to the form of Ladino that was spoken on roads that had been modified over the centuries. Stella's father, who was a merchant, spoke Turkish at work. The mother, who had Greek friends, spoke Greek. The older sisters had been educated by the Alliance Universelle and so spoke in French. Then the Italians came, making it officially their territory, governmentally, politically, in 1923. French was out in terms of the school system. Italian came in. So you have a family who at home is speaking Judeo-Spanish, but at school, this older siblings learned in one language, the younger ones in another. The parents do not speak Italian. Everyone understands liturgical Hebrew. The synagogue is directly across the street, and the calendar dominated, the religious calendar organized and dominated their lives. So Stella is born into this world of polyglottism, but also a world that was multifaceted in the fact that she still had her grandmothers, who were born in the mid-19th century, alive, carrying all of this wonderful, rich tradition, superstition, cures, proverbs, as I said earlier, ways of living. They never were seen going to the beach, whereas of course Stella and her sisters and her friends were basically beach bums. The family had a cabina right down the street at the beach where they lived all summer. She never saw her grandmothers undressed. She never saw their hair down. One of them never left the neighborhood. The other one was more worldly. She was a healer.
And the family seems, it's quite a matrilineal story. There's so many.
It's very matrilineal. The mother was more modern thinking. So, as a young woman, and she's the seventh born is the other thing to say. She's the seventh child born into this family. So she's the recipient of all of the stories that were reached back way before her life, because she hears them from her siblings, from her mother, from her grandmothers. She also has a lot of models about how to be a young woman. And I think that's also one of the really fascinating questions presented to her as a human being when she's born. Is like, who do I want to be? Who's my model? What is my future? And, traditionally, young women in that neighborhood, in that time, in that community, and in that place, hit 15, they got out that embroidery needle and started making their trousseau. They were preparing for marriage. That was going to be their fate. Stella had no interest in that whatsoever. And where did she look to, and to whom did she look for alternate models? There was her grandmother, the healer, who had traveled to the Holy Land, as it was called in Palestine then, hoping to die because it was the holiest thing to do, but never dying. So stocking up on her cures and her potions and her powders, coming back to do her good work. There was her mother, who was, I think, a very modern thinker, quite honestly, from everything I've heard from Stella. There was her older sister, Felicie, the intellectual of the family, who had no interest in getting married, who had gone to the Italian high school. So she had somewhat more education, markedly more education than other women in the community. And then comes Stella, who gets it into her head as early as 14 that she's going to go to university and study in Italy. And this is, of course, thanks to the thinking and the sense of openness and possibility that, though a fascist government, the Italians brought to the island. I think it's important to stress that they were still living under fascism, as becomes important in 1938 in the story. But at the same time, they brought not just another language, but a connection to a country where there were other paths for young women, other paths for young men, other possibilities where they brought movies, and they brought music, and they brought different food, and they brought ideas that were other, and Stella and new people of new cultures, of new backgrounds, new languages, new sensibilities, all of this appealed greatly to the young Stella. So it's important, I think, to see that she really did, she had this Janus-headed experience of life as a young woman that looked very much back and very much saw and was formed by the place she'd been born into, but also looked ahead with great hope for her future.
And one of the things that I found so interesting about the story is that in part, obviously, it's a story of the destruction of this community in this, horrible, violent way. But she also acknowledges that the community was going to change in any case, right? So that there's a kind of, and And we should say that the entire, as I said, the entire community is deported, but no one comes back. Almost nobody survives. I think she said that like 160 people out of
10% of the community survived. But yeah, you're right to point out that it was already undergoing a change because the economics changed under the Italians. The island, the delicate balance of the island, let's see, politically and economically under the Turks, in which they lived really, I mean, there are, of course, bad things that happen, but they lived relatively peacefully with the Turks and with the Greeks, later even with the Italians. But the young men were already starting well before the war to go abroad to seek their fortunes in the Congo, in Rhodesia, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in New York. One would go
and several of her siblings go. So she,
in fact, yes. So like there's this attrition that happens. Many of the young men of professional age go, though they return, and find a matchmaker to find themselves a bride, which is what happened to her older sister Selma. She left, and then her older sister Selma, right? Then Sada, the other sister, followed her. Meanwhile, even before Stella and her next older sister Renee were born, the very firstborn boy of the family, Morris, had gone to Los Angeles at 13 with his aunt and uncle. So, which is, I find very haunting, this idea that this family never existed in one place at one time, because Stella and Renee didn't meet Morris until after the war, which is just, it was quite characteristic of certain large families in the Judea, but I find it startling when I think about it. Yeah. So yes, it was a world in dramatic transition, with a lot of absence, with an understanding of what it meant, what absence meant. And people went away and they were not obviously emailing or in FaceTime touch. It was a letter was a major event. News traveled through the Judea community very much with lines of communication open through doors, windows, sitting outside, gossip. There wasn't a lot of privacy, for better or for worse. But everyone knew where everyone was and what the fates were of all of these departed, vigorous young people.
And there's both, I got the sense from the way she told the stories and the way you wrote them, that there was both a sense of hope and excitement about that, but also grief, a real sense that there was something that was being lost. And there was, as you said, these absences in the community. And then the nature of that grief changes when the entire community is decimated.
Right. Yes, that going back to the second part of your and just to clarify your question. Well, I mean, just in rapid summary, in 1938, Mussolini passes the racial laws. Stella's kicked out of school, dashing her idea that she's on the verge of going to high school. Following her sister, her hopes there are dashed, though something creative happens in response to that. In 1943, the Germans seized the island from the Italians, and in 1944, yes, the entire community, all 1,700 plus of them, mostly older people at that point, and these younger women, are deported, and 10% of them survive the camps, and virtually, effectively, nobody returns to live there, which I find also a really notable fact. I understand it, but it's really quite something that the community, imagining what it was like, this place where, as Stella describes it often to me, is like, this was our own piece of the earth. They withstood many changes of government historically and rulers, and it was theirs. They were consistently there. There were Jews there even in the ancient world, but this group of Jews could trace its roots back to the expulsion from Spain, and just the idea that really essentially overnight, this entire community lost its 500-year-old connection to this part of the earth is startling.
And Stella didn't go back until the 1970s, right? And
you mean personally? Yes. I mean, of course,
to visit that.
There was a lot of emotional and psychological weight that I think that she carried with her. And no, she didn't return to Rhodes until the 70s. And then being Stella, because she's a adaptable person, I think, and also an engaged person and a curious person. And she engaged with this place again in a very different way, obviously. But it was so 35 years after the deportation, she came back, and then she integrated it into her life and went more and more frequently.
And you
Not
accompanied her there in 2015.
2015, yeah, just after I'd met her. Yeah, that was, we were very early on in our connection and in our conversations. And I happened to be in Italy. I knew she was there. And it was a kind of strange, intuitive feeling that was well before I thought I was going to write this book. And I thought, I just knew, she's 92. She was there on her own. And I basically invited myself to pop over, which she said later, I think gave her more confidence in me. It made her trust me even more that I went to that trouble. And it was a very, very interesting experience. I didn't know a fragment of what, of course, I would come to know. And my dream, and in COVID, before COVID, I had started to try to put in motion this plan of returning with her again, which would have been such a beautiful way to bookend this experience, because I would see it all so differently, with so many of her stories now, tucked into my own brain, let's say. But then it was a strange form of time travel almost, because the Judidian now is full of these mostly dreadful, honestly, tourist shops, on a certain level, and so a certain main street. And that under them were all the regular places in which regular life was once lived, and which brought out so many stories. And Stella, and so as I walked down those streets with her, it was like the modern world kind of vanished before my eyes, and I began to go back in time with her. And then there are things that are just so poignant, like once you leave the obvious streets and you penetrate more deeply into the side parts, let's say, of the neighborhood, there are still houses that are bombed and have never been rebuilt since the war, which is quite striking. Bombed, in this case, by the British after the Germans took the island, during and after the time, because the bombing began before the deportation and certainly afterward. There are inscriptions in Hebrew. There are traces of the ancient world. There are traces of the knights. Their imprint is the Knights Hospitalier. Their mark is very strong on the island. All the things that Stella would come to tell me about were visible to me then, but all the more acute for being related by her, of course.
Mm-hmm. Why did you choose to open the book with that scene of the two of you there?
Well, I was hoping it would capture the reader's attention, let's say. And it was also because, honestly, on that trip, she wasn't so happy. And I was trying to think a lot about what that was. And I think it was before she'd begun to tell me this whole story. I don't know what she would feel going back again. Because of COVID, we've never been able to discover that. But it stayed with me, her restlessness that time. And, and I quote her saying in the book, maybe you can't go back. I mean, she had been going back, but there was something more, maybe on some level she sensed this could be, if you're 92 and making a trip like that, I repeat, on your own, which is pretty startling. You have to know that it's logical to assume, let's just say, that you may not be making many or any more. And so I think it carried some of that weight, and that made it all the more powerful for me.
Right. She says, maybe you can only go back in your mind. And then, of course, in telling you the stories, that's effectively
precisely what she does. Yeah. And, what does it mean to stand in 2015 in front of a building where you and 1,600 and 1,700 people, many of whom or are related to, were effectively, essentially imprisoned for 2 days before you were put on boats, marched through town, put on boats and taken away from the island? What does that mean to stand there? What is that? What is this building? What is that place? It is, if it has the meaning it has, it comes from the woman telling you what happened there, obviously, but to be there with her, I can still see standing in front of it, this, a very undistinguished 30s building, but a place of such significance in the history of that community and to her personally.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there's so many layers of that throughout the story, right? Like, even as you're saying that your conversations were in Italian, and Italian had represented this kind of culture and opportunity for education. And then also the Italians turned over the list of those 1,700 names of the community to the Nazis. And that's how they were able to march them all down to the port and put them on boats. So the kind of layers at which that operates is also, there's
yes,
that
the language and culture that in which she feels most comfortable. We've had a lot of talks about this, like what is the language in which, or which defines you? That's a harder question. That culture had a lot of attraction to Stella. She made friends who were Italian. She saw a future for herself that was only because of the Italians, but at the same time, punishingly, it was the Italian fascist government that took away her civil rights and those of her entire family, friends, and community in 1938. And as you point out, in time, 6 years later, led to the destruction of that community, which is just something, that is really the end stopping point of that colonial gesture of theirs. Of course, unwitting at the beginning, but that is where it ended.
So you referenced this already, but she describes the racial laws in 1938 that prevented Jews from attending school as one of the major ruptures and kind of traumas in her life. And she'd been looking forward to university. How did that rupture change her, do you think?
Well, she has more than once told me that it was the most devastating thing that happened to her in her life. And this is going to sound possibly problematic, but I think when she'll even put it in a category with the camps and saying, and the way she's phrased it to me, and I capture her saying it in the book, is that in the camps, at least you knew who the enemy was, you know who was good and who was bad, you knew what you had to do, in theory. But being kicked out of school, and I do understand this, it's like you can't see who it is. You're not coming face to face with the commandante. You're not coming face to face with your barracks, policeman or the head of the barracks. You're not coming face to face with Mussolini. You're facing the fact that you cannot do the thing that any human being in modern world should have a right to, which is attend school, And that went on from there. Her father had to take on an Italian partner business. Jewish doctors couldn't treat Jewish patients. They couldn't go for a time to the cinema, to the social club, to the theater, to the opera, to the beach. All of that also happened, though, on roads. Some of the implementation and enforcement of those laws was a little bit fuzzy because, again, it was particular. Roads had a particular character, and then they were never ghettoized, the Jews, even after the Germans took over. They never wore stars on their coats. It wasn't a case that looked like, a situation that looked like ones that we think about more typically during the war. And so it was a very deeply injuring experience for Stella, even though, and again, I talk about this in the book, and I think it's one of the more representative things that Stella ever did in her life, representative that is of her remarkable character and grit and creativity, which is that one day, not long after she'd been kicked out of school, she happened to be in the bookstore in the Giuditta, where she met Luigi Noferini, who was a teacher at the boys' version, let's say the boys' high school, Catholic high school, and instead of the girls' one where Stella was had expected to attend. And he said, well, what are you going to do about your education now? And as I had a conversation with someone earlier this fall who said to me, it's notable, though, that she was in the bookstore, right? So that in itself says something about who Stella was. And together, they cooked up this scheme that he and 3 of his colleagues, who eventually agreed, and also a couple of the remaining older boys in the neighborhood, would get together and continue the education of anyone who wanted to. And it was Stella, the only girl, which I find fascinating, and 5 boys who attended a secret school, illegal, which could have gotten these teachers into great trouble if it had been discovered. And they were able to do their best to stay on program with the curriculum. And that says so much about Stella to me. It was not as good as going to school, of course, but it was a solution within a regrettably recalibrated world.
Right. And it gave her an opportunity to build these relationships with older mentor friends.
Yes,
that
yes.
were important to her.
Relationships that became complicated by other feelings as time unfolded, as it happened, but not in a way that we would, in a way that felt quite all right for her. So it's not in a threatening or, an abusive way, but these were great enlightened people who opened worlds for her. She was someone who wanted to be educated, who was curious. And so this man was a singer, and he knew art history, and he knew literature, and he represented her ideal, which was to become a cultivated human being,
And she also talks about how the kind of disruption of the occupation, or whatever you want to call it, of the war, allowed for some freedom from expectations of what a young woman could do. And so she actually had a lot more, and some of this had to do with the fact that, as you said, her mother was sort of a little more free thinking and allowed her more mobility, but she had a lot more flexibility in terms of how she leaned into that and kind of exercised it in particular ways that maybe a lot of other young women wouldn't have. But she could come and go in ways that would certainly not have been true of girls of a different time in her community.
Absolutely. And well, it was a combination of things. It was the young men not being there meant that the father's business started to spiral downward. He also he became ill. And so they needed more money. And so there were no boys to go, the sons were not there to go get jobs. So Stella and her sisters did. And that would not have happened before. And also because, as Stella's pointed out to me a couple of times, I think even today young people tend to be friends with their direct cohort age-wise, but because so many people had left, those boundaries dissolved. So she became friends with older girls and boys, and Greek friendships became more intimate, and she made friends with Italian men and boys, so all of these more traditional divisions by age, class, nationality, blurred in ways that then gave her more of a sense of autonomy and independence and adventure even. So, the war grows you up is a version of that, and as things became even worse, she learned how to go deal in the black market to try to get food. The mother had to eventually pawn her jewelry. It became more and more desperate as things became darker, getting closer to 43 and 44. And they made do.
We'll turn to that in a minute. I see there's a question in the chat about, and I realize I'm not sure about the answer of this either. Was Stella's family home still there when she went back?
It was. It was there even when she went back in the first time, and it's still there today. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She's never been inside again.
She doesn't want to go inside?
I know.
Yeah, interesting.
No.
Yeah. Maybe I'll show that little clip of the video just to bring a little bit of her spirit into the room.
Yes, because everything I can say is just me saying it, but it would be wonderful if you could see a tiny snippet of her, sure.
Yeah, so let's see. Let me pull that up just a second and share the screen. Oh, wait, I have to make sure that I'm sharing the sound. Okay.
She told me stories in Turkish,
Haydi, tra il panesico.
French,
C'est le grand lusticoli qui passe e passerà.
Italian,
Perché c'era tanta gente, sembrava insomma che tutti siamo gli stessi, ma no.
Judeo-Spanish, of course,
Per esempio, ecco per dire, los buenos de vosotros.
and English.
What I think is really that if you want, you can do many things even at 100.
And she sang songs.
De las altas mares.
Many songs.
En passant par la Lorraine avec mes sabots de amor, perché mi fa ricordare mia mamma.
Stop there. But you can get a sense, I think, of her spirit and her joy through some of those very short pieces.
Yeah, you definitely can.
So
Yeah.
you ask her many times throughout your conversations over the years and in different ways about what they knew about what was happening to Jews in Europe, why they weren't more worried about what was happening to them already, what was unfolding on the island. How did she respond to those inquiries?
Well, I mean, this is its own journey we had to take. As I said, it took time for us to trust each other, for which you might read even more for her to trust me, which is understandable. Stella, one of the reasons I think she had not told her story before in any depth is that she very determinedly did not want to be a storyteller of the Shoah. That was very clear from the beginning. And I, not only did I understand that, but I respected it. And I didn't think that was the best way to tell her life or use to which to put her life story. Again, central though that experience was. And Stella does not offer let's say a cozy or comforting account of that time. Yes, she is alive, and as she said to me, I chose life. She says that now, but she's also angry and confounded and very often sharply corrective of some of my ideas. I approached it using what I had what I'm made of, which is that I'm born when I'm born. I grew up where I grew up. I've read what I've read. I try to project myself, as we all do. I think when we hear these stories, into that situation. I sometimes somewhat lightly refer to Rhodes as the Malibu of the Mediterranean. I grew up in Los Angeles. I know what it's like to grow up on the beach and to have that kind of love of water and air, and to be in a fragrant, temperate climate where the flowers and food are delicious. And I sense, I was there, I could feel it. And making that transition, asking those questions, asking her to turn in that direction, bringing my own blinded, let's call it imperfect me to the conversation with her, left me open for quite a bit of rebuke and correction and education. Mm-hmm. And so I've come to think that, number one, it may be inappropriate for me to have an idea about what that was like, but I had to ask, and I asked, and she told me things. And I write about it in the book quite clearly, I think. And I do believe that though there were many signals coming from the wider world, they had, for example, refugee boats would dock at roads that were trying to get from Europe to Palestine. There were reports that made it through the censored newspaper and radio. Don't forget that information was very limited and very controlled. At the core, and this is why I mentioned the Malibu of the Mediterranean thing, they did not, that was not happening in that place. It was happening in the other place. It was not happening to these Sephardic Jews. It was happening to those Ashkenazi Jews. And even the degree of not knowing extended to Salonika, where they did not know about that deportation. So many times she said to me, we simply did not know. Now, that can be nuanced to some degree because families of means left. They knew which ways, let's say, as I think I put it, the winds are blowing. The Levys themselves tried to join the other children, the older children in America. I think less out of fear of what was coming, because I don't think they knew, but out of the fact that they were running out of money, that the racial laws had restricted, eliminated their civil rights, that life was not good. And so, yes, you would want to go for that reason alone. And they were denied. You know, Ken Burns has just made this big documentary about what that was like in that climate. They were among the people like the Frank family, like Otto Frank. They had applied. There were too many of them. There were 4, or whatever reason was given at that moment, who could even possibly reconstruct it. And they did not know.
And
They
I think
simply did not know.
it raises this whole question even about like what knowing is even possible, right? Like when you're talking about things that are beyond comprehension, basically, what does it even mean to know, right? And I think part of what Stella talks about, which I found so powerful, is she talks about this kind of split that happens in her selfhood, right? Like that there's the Stella that was on Rhodes and there was the Stella in the camps. And she talks very openly about how she's not sure she's ever been really able to fully integrate the different Stellas that existed. And part of that is about knowing, right? It's part of it is that the Stella who knew the reality of the camps doesn't fit in with a person in the normal world anymore.
Yes, I think you're quite right. And yeah, what does knowing mean? And also, even if you have an inkling of knowledge as you're getting onto those boats, I mean, they were told stories too. They were being told that they were going to be settled somewhere else, that they were going to go to another island. You know, they were being told stories. There were people, I was just reading it somewhere the other day, you know, that it was on the New Yorker podcast that David Remnick did, you know, as they were walking into the ovens, they did not know. So there was a lot of structure around that was determined to keep them from knowing for obvious reasons. Like Estella's pointed out to me, well, they knew there were several hundred of them on this boat with this one captain. You know, it's not like they were guarded. Like how easy would it have been to do something?
Right.
So.
Right. And I think that this question about knowing also relates to another piece that's really interesting in this book, which is about memory, right? And like, there's what you know, and then there's also like what you're capable of remembering and holding on to. And I feel like you must have learned a lot through this process about memory and how it works, and also how it sometimes doesn't work, right? Like Stella acknowledged that she had some blank spots, like from the train to Auschwitz, that was just, there were blank spots in her memory. And she clearly is, as we've said, like as she's circling around these stories, she's remembering different things at different times. So what were some of the things that you witnessed about that process?
That's also a great question. You know, I mean, I say in the book in the end quite carefully that I recognize that this is the recollection of a nearly century-old human being, right? So Stella has all her life taken in information subsequent to her experience, the things that she experienced, that certainly has reshaped, deepened, colored, negated, altered. You can think of every possibility. But I also watched her do a good job of trying to peel back as well as she could. And she's telling a story about her life, and I'm telling a story about the story of her life. So I offer it, I heard it, assimilated it, and I offer it with the best intentions of seeking truth, while realizing that many points could be open to review, but I think the emotional truth is there. And I have read a lot, and fascinatingly to me, and I was always a little bit surprised by this, because sometimes I think when a story starts spinning, you think you're in the land of make-believe, but then I would go off and read, and I would be really astonished by how often the things Stella told me were supported by other people's accounts, or by historians, or even in points of disagreement, close enough, aligned enough that it's still, in my mind, possible enough that Stella's version is correct. And that was itself a fascinating experience, just to, basically be fact-checking Scheherazade, if that makes any sense to you, and find like, oh, wow, it was like that. And even after we finished the book, bless her soul, Stella would come to me with things that she had conveniently remembered, maybe some of the more juicy things that she hadn't told me, or she would offer bits and pieces of things that hadn't quite been finished. And I would, of course, get rather mad at her, mad between quotation marks, like, you've been holding out on me. But that goes back to something I was saying earlier, is that if you don't know what to ask, it's like looking into the void and the negative space or the shadow story. You can try your best to try to imagine it and guess at it and prod around for it, but there's always going to be something that you don't know,
And part of it is also, that's her way to have the agency of shaping her own story, right? By telling you what she wants to tell you and leaving
of course
she doesn't want to. And I think that's how a smart person who understands that what she's doing is not just telling you her story, but reconstructing her life on some level, that she didn't want to let go of that. I mean, it's clear that she's a very independent-minded person and somebody who has always liked to, forge her own path. And was doing that in her 90s in her conversations with you as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that takes some reckoning with sometimes, I think. It's taught me a lot about the limitations of inquiry also, about, there's something a little bit psychoanalytic about the relationship in two directions. I think she learned things about herself and I learned things about myself, because here we are in this closed room, the same space week after week, in all seasons, with this sort of quality of time slowing down as these stories were being told and as I was trying to understand them. And there's a lot of discovery about who you are and who the other person is in that context.
Right. And we do a lot of oral history work at the Jewish Women's Archive. And one of the things that I always say is that, people have this idea that if you interview someone, you're the one who's learning about their life. But the truth is the learning is happening on both sides, and it's meaningful to both people to be heard, that being listened to is an act that it's not about one person being active and one person being passive. It's a very
mutual.
Yeah, it's mutual, and it's like mutually both people are learning and understanding things at the same time. I'm curious. There was a question in there here too about like, what was her process in terms of, were there things that you two talked about that she said, that she like cut from the manuscript and said, this is off the record?
A couple. Not that many, that's one of the things about Stella that I find particularly courageous. This, I think, goes back to what we were saying earlier about her as the kind of woman she was and what the kind of mother and grandmother she had and older sister Felicie she had. She's not afraid to say things that I think other people of her, I don't even want to say of her generation, but people who grew up in a kind of community, a traditional community that she did, would have hesitated to say, just her whole idea about, for her, the unattractiveness of marriage, for example. I mean, there are many layers to that. She puts a lot of value on friendship. Her connection to the world is very strong, and I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot from the different ways one can be connected. She doesn't think and set ideas about a lot of things, and that goes for marriage, friendship, what's appropriate for a woman to do or not to do. I mean, she has things that, of course, she can't escape because she is a product of her time and place, but and how one should talk about the Holocaust and use the Holocaust, whatever that means, represent it, engage with it, define, in her case, preferably not define herself by it. I do not want to be a victim, she said to me, or see myself as a victim. She was a victim. She does not want to see herself as a victim.
And she
These
doesn't
are
want
all-
other people to see herself that way. And someone actually
Yes.
asked in the chat about something that's mentioned very much in passing in the book, which is that she and her sister have their numbers on their arms surgically removed when they get to the States.
Yes, they do. Absolutely. You know, all of that is true. And then there's another layer, quite honestly, because she is defined by that experience. We are listening to her story because of that experience. She does have things to say to us about that experience. We don't know that much, most of us, maybe a lot of you do, but about what it was like to be Sephardic Jewish in the camps, right? Everyone had their own experience of the camps. For all the commonality, there is all the particularities. And she's told me things that I had not heard before, or had not focused on hearing before, you know, moments where they sang, where they danced, where they laughed at the absurdity of it. You know, it felt more, in a funny way, more dangerous because it was more normal and at certain moments, while at the same time being utterly other, you know. And I think that's why these stories are so important to hear, and to hear from the people who've lived them, you know, to be sitting in the room with the person who was there to tell you it wasn't exactly this, it was more like this. And you know, and I could go on forever about what that's like.
One of the things I thought I was really struck by and thought was so beautiful is when she talks about, you know, standing there for, you know, a selection or something in the camps, and it was snowing, and it was the first time she experienced snow, and just that idea that, right, of course, it's not all about being in a death camp. It's also about the experience of the world that you're having, which can have these moments of beauty and wonder, even in the midst of the most awful circumstances.
Exactly. I think akin to that is when she pointed out to me that the first, you know, all she wanted to do was leave. Don't forget, she grew up in a very provincial, faraway place, and she wanted to be educated. She wanted to see the world. She wanted to travel in Italy. And, you know, when she said to me, well, you realize the first time I saw Europe was through the window of the train. I mean, right. The first time I went to Italy as an Italian citizen was after I was liberated, you know, right. But you have to pause for a minute to think in terms of just, you know, regular life, which brackets and kind of, as you say, threads its way through. This is not to diminish all the highly irregular and tragic and surreal and absurd things that also happen, but I think we have those more in the forefront often of our consciousness, and a little bit less how they coexisted with other things.
So I want to make sure you get to read a little piece, because I want people to hear some of the beauty of the language.
I'm sorry, I resisted that earlier, but I did sort of feel it would be better if we came to it.
Yeah. No, it is. It does. The piece that you want to read does feel like it works better at the end. So
yes, I hope it's not too long. Maybe I'll jump. Let me just take a quick look and see.
Sure. And I'll say while you do that one other thing about the book that is really spectacular, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, is that it's illustrated by Myra Kalman, who we've actually had on our book talks before, last year when she, or maybe it was 2 years ago, I've lost all track of time, when she illustrated Gertrude Stein's The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. But she does these beautiful, beautiful, very colorful paintings, and it was an interesting choice to use those instead of photographs, but it really is very.
And I should say a word about that. I think, you know, in the same way that we're back to the encounter, but in the same way that I translate Stella's story, both from Italian to English, but also from Stella's way of telling a story to Michael's way of telling a story, I thought that it was, Myra had heard about Stella and offered to illustrate the book. And I liked that because it was another encounter. You know, it was not this like, oh, well, here she describes the mother and look, there's the mother, you know, that rather literal thing that sometimes we do, even, you know, the more sensitive readers among us. And so Myra did a great job, I think, in having her encounter with Stella, and also being who she is. She intuited and I think felt the beauty and color of that place that I did my best to convey, but it's not, I don't have all the paintbrushes in my, you know, in my pocket that she does. So we are laid in the book, this passage I'm going to read to you. And it comes after I asked Stella, I'm just going to abbreviate it here. Why did she wait so long to tell her story? And why? And she says, I didn't want my identity to be fixed in that way. I didn't want that number tattooed on my arm. I didn't want them to look at me and gasp, poverina. I didn't want to be a victim. Stella goes on to add that there were plenty of people who had already told their stories, besides, notably for her, but stories well, besides, notably for her, Primo Levy, and there's no relation, by the way, between them, himself. And there was a personal reason why she resisted telling her story. She heard a critical voice in her mind, largely her own critical voice. She sees that now, asking who she thought she was, wondering by what authority she was to speak about the Juderia, about the life that happened there and afterward. But her thinking has changed over the years, especially as she's grown older. Many things, she said to me, come to you late in life. I've never said this before, but when you arrive at a certain age, you're no longer afraid of being ridiculous. After a moment, she adds, and then you came along, and you were curious and patient with me, even though I wasn't always so easy. And in speaking to you, I've learned a good deal about myself. As I tell you my stories, I learn. One thing I learned is that there is no single truth. There is a changing truth along that camino de la nostra vita. And you understand a good deal from going back, returning, and more than once to what you thought you knew and felt and believed. And in the end, you know, I trusted you. I point out that it took Stella rather a long while before she did. You have to earn trust, Michael. Wouldn't you agree? I do agree, I say, but I think also that it might require a leap of faith on both sides. Stella takes this in. We both took that leap, I believe, she says. The silence that envelops us feels almost material, to be made of something tangible like cloth, like a large sail or a tent, a sail that has captured the wind that carried us on this journey, a tent that has defined and enclosed our time together over many Saturdays, over these many years. There's something else, Stella says after a moment. Oh, well, our talking, it seems like it's kept me alive.
That's beautiful. And it does feel like there's a lot to learn from Stella about how to age and how to live at every stage of life. I have to say, I kept thinking about her as I was reading the book, thinking, oh my goodness, how did she fare during COVID? You know, what was that like for her? It must have been hard to be isolated and yeah, I don't know.
It was hard. It was hard. She went to live with her son in New Jersey for a big chunk of it. And it was at the time that I started writing the book, because I was in isolation too. But we had some of our best conversations by phone in that period, you know, where I went back to re-ask her for the 14th time for details. And yeah, not easy. Not easy to be old and living on your own, period, right? And then you add COVID in, and very challenging. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Michael, so much for sharing Stella's story with us, for giving us this glimpse into the history of Jewish roads and of this very special woman, and for making it a story about life. I mean, I think that part of, and someone said something like this in the chat as well, that, you know, sometimes even people who are known because they lived through the horrors of the Shoah, that you can see that actually it's not a story about that. It's a story about a community and a history that lives, and even if it has changed over time. And I think it also represents a dynamic that's very much at the heart of JWA, that every person's story is unique and valuable, and that it also has something to teach us about a larger historical story. So thank you so much for giving that to us.
I appreciate it so much. And for those of you who are in New York, I just want to say and want to hear more, on November 30th, Stella and I will be at B'nai Jeshurun at 7 o'clock, and you can Google for details. And I think it's quite amazing to see her in person, and knock on wood that she makes it and she's feeling up to it that night. And you'll see our dynamic, which, you know, we use a lot of humor in our conversation. That may not have been coming through tonight here. But yeah, there's always more to learn about the story. I'm still learning more about it, and I learn from questions and questioners like you. So thank you so very much.
And for all of you, if there's more that you want to learn about some of this history, I will say that JWA about 18 years ago did a big oral history project in Seattle, which has a very large community of Jews from Turkey and Greece, including Rhodes. And several of the community leaders that we interviewed were women from Rhodes, from families that came from there. And you can learn more about them on our site. We're going to put the links to that in the chat. And you can also learn more about Sephardi and Mizrahi women in the US in our encyclopedia, and we'll put that link there too. And finally, the last thing I want to say in terms of our resources is that obviously this book really emphasizes the importance of asking questions and listening to stories. And that's something we really believe in. And we encourage you to interview the people in your life and community. And we have our own resources of JWA's Story Aperture app, our mobile app, which has question sets. And you can record an interview and upload it to our archive. So I invite everyone to partner with us in documenting the stories of Jewish women. And I invite everyone to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll have the next in our series, December 1st, same time, same place, conversation with the writer and musician Alicia Jo Rabins about her book, Even God Had Bad Parenting Days, which is musings on Torah and parenting. It's really beautiful. And Alicia is a great friend of JWA. Some of you may have seen her here before. And until then, be well. Happy Thanksgiving for those of you who are celebrating. And thank you so much for being with us tonight. Good night, everybody.